Hi, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to today's event, which we're all really excited about. My name is David Pavlich. I am a member of the board of the Friends of Lorine Niedecker. And I'm just going to start with some introductions about Niedecker, the poet, and a little bit about the Friends before I introduce Patrick. And then Patrick is going to give a talk today and then lead us in a conversation. So we're happy to have you all here today, and we hope that some of you will participate with your questions and with your conversation. So I think we're hoping to have this be at least somewhat of an interactive talk today. So as I mentioned, I'm a member of the board of the Friends of Lorine Niedecker. For those of you who aren't familiar with her work, I'm guessing that many of you are. But if you aren't, Lorine Niedecker was a poet who was active in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on. She lived up until 1970 here in Wisconsin. I'm actually joining you. Many of you are not in Wisconsin, but I am. I'm just a short drive from Black Hawk Island, Wisconsin. I'm joining you from Madison. Niedecker was, associated with a group of poets that came to be um, referred to as the objectivists. She published in small presses and little magazines such as Origin, Wild Hawthorne, and the Jargon Society. If you aren't familiar with Niedecker's work, probably the best way to familiarize yourself with that work is to take a look at this book, The Collected Works, which is available through the University of California Press. So get in touch with your local bookstore or your local library and see if you can get a copy of this to take a look at. The Friends of Lorine Niedecker is a nonprofit organization. We're dedicated to expanding and preserving the legacy of Niedecker herself. We do a lot of different activities, including supporting the Niedecker papers and archives, which are located in Fort Atkinson. We do public programming like this, and members of this organization have preserved Niedecker's home on Black Hawk Island, which is now a historic landmark, and you're able to visit. So if you're interested in learning more about the organization and the things that we do, you can visit this website, and we're always happy to take contributions that help our programming and our activities possible. I am going to briefly introduce Patrick, but before that, I wanted to thank Woodland Pattern Book Center in Milwaukee for helping us to promote this event and acting as a great partner for this event tonight. So part of the mission, as I mentioned, of the Friends of Lorine Niedecker is to develop programming that supports and furthers the art of innovative poetry. Probably, I would say specifically poetry of place or poetry that could be seen as within the same, I guess, tradition of Niedecker's work. Last year, we started a new virtual poetry reading series called North Central, which is named after Niedecker's 1968 book published by Fulcrum Press in London. So far, that series has featured several poets, including most recently Meryl Gilfillan, Sarah Ellen Fowler, and Jose Felipe Alvergue. The poetry reading series takes place twice per year. We have one reading that happens in the fall and another happens in the spring. I'm really happy to introduce today's talk, which is the first virtual talk that we added to this growing body of virtual programming. Our hope and our expectation is that we'll host one of these virtual talks each year, likely around the same time. I'm especially happy to introduce today Patrick Morrissey. the inaugural speaker in this series of talks. I first met Patrick several years ago. I can't actually remember if that was in Louisville or if it was in Durham, North Carolina. I think it was in one of those places. At any rate, he's an ideal writer, I think, to open this talk series because Patrick is a sensitive reader and an acute observer, like Niedecker herself was. He carries his learning lightly and has a very warm spirit. And he spent more time thinking about Niedecker's poetry than most of us. I think he'll challenge us today and get us to think of Niedecker's work from slightly different angles. Patrick is the author of 3 books of poetry, most recently Lightbox, which was published by Verge Books in 2023, and I think we have at least one of the publishers of Verge Books here tonight. His essays have appeared recently in Annulet, a Journal of Poetics, the Chicago Review, and Textual Practice, and he teaches at the University of Chicago. Friends of Lorine Niedecker are very happy to welcome Patrick tonight for this virtual talk. So I'm going to hand things over to you, Patrick. Welcome.
Thanks, David. Thanks everybody for being here. It's great to see so many familiar faces in the Zoom room and some names that I have recognized, but people I've never met. Really, really cool to the way an event like this can bring unlikely combinations of people together. And thanks to David and to Chuck Stubbleton and to Rick Meyer for this invitation. It's really an honor and a pleasure, more importantly, to be giving this inaugural talk for an organization that is dear to my heart and about a poet whose work is really important to me. So, as David said, I think I'm going to talk for a little bit. I've got probably about 20 minutes of prepared material I've written to share with you. And then I'm hoping we can kind of open it up and talk. And so I'm really curious to hear people's responses to what I have to say, comments on any of the poems I present. So I certainly invite you to, any bits and pieces, particles of language, anything you hear that catches your ear, please do write that down, and we'll see where the conversation takes us afterward. Okay. So this talk is called Niedecker's Binoculars. And it's a talk in 3 parts. 1, binoculars. I've carried Lorine Niedecker's poems with me for many years. Her lines and phrases echo in my head and in my own poems so often that I almost take them for granted. The constancy of her language in my daily life and writing is a case of deep and thorough influence. The flowing in of something fluid, subtle, as of water or astral forces, sometimes almost imperceptible, yet always powerfully moving. Niedecker's poetry is a secret that keeps whispering in my mind's ear, and I'm thinking of this talk as an amplification of that whisper, at least to the level of a secret we all might share. For I take it I'm not the only one in this virtual room for whom Niedecker is an essential poet. Back in graduate school, I wrote a dissertation chapter on Niedecker and gave a talk or 2 about her work. But I put that work aside long ago. I sometimes discuss her poems with my students, and last year I wrote and published a single paragraph about a single poem of hers. But until now, I have shied away from writing my Niedecker essay because it seemed too deep a task. But I couldn't refuse this invitation. So I went back to the poems and I read them all again, thinking about where I might begin. And I kept returning to this poem. And I'm going to share my screen with you. Everybody see that? Okay. This is an untitled poem from the 1950s. The death of my poor father leaves debts and two small houses. To settle this estate, 1,000 fees arise. I enrich the law. Before my own death is certified, recorded, final judgment judged, taxes taxed, I shall own a book of old Chinese poems and binoculars to probe the river trees. In writing about this poem years ago, I focused on the way it pits poetry against economic law. With the death of Henry Niedecker, Lorine must face the economic exigencies her father held at bay. We might hear a weary joke in Estate, which plays his debts and small properties off an image of landed affluence. In this poem, wealth is held by lenders and the law itself. And Niedecker wryly acknowledges the way her own status as a property owner, however tenuous, helps sustain that distribution. She invokes the New Testament, but this final judgment takes place in the Office of Municipal Records, and the tax collectors win in the end. Yet the bureaucratic capture of the poet is not total. Some part of her life exceeds the law, the part that persists in poetry and in the birds perched above the Rock River. We might say that Niedecker wishes to turn ownership against itself, paring down her property to only two objects, both of which almost undo their own objecthood by becoming see-through. A book of Chinese poems and a pair of binoculars. Both are instruments of attention to the natural world that survives as wild substrate, even as land is bounded, bought, and sold. Birds trespass without knowing it, and water heeds no property line. Thus, the poem counters fees with river trees. But what most interests and puzzles me now, upon rereading the poem's peculiar pattern, is the poem's peculiar pattern of doubles, which is perhaps most obvious in the phrases final judgment judged and taxes taxed. The primary emphasis of those past participles would seem to be the completion or execution of a task, that is, judgment made or taxes collected. Yet the simple repetition simultaneously seems to turn the nouns back on themselves, as if final judgment itself might be questioned and reassessed, say, second-guessed, and thus made less final, or as if something might be demanded or exacted from taxes themselves, as if the offices of power might finally be held to account, even as they measure and certify one's life and death. Another double is the pair of binoculars Niedecker claims as her own. Binocular vision is, of course, the capacity to see with two eyes, which provides depth perception, among other things. Those of us who see with two eyes always see a single thing from two angles at once and effectively synthesize two images into one before we know it. That's how we see in three dimensions. And a pair of binoculars doubles our naked eyes, thus creating a doubly complex experience of scale. We can see what's distant as near, even as we know it remains far away. By lowering and raising binoculars to our eyes, we quickly reframe our view, displacing or perhaps overlaying one field of vision with another. Done too quickly, the effect can be dizzying, but done with some patience, it affords a vivid glimpse of details in place, a sense of simultaneous focus and expansion. That Niedecker pairs binoculars with a book of old Chinese poems suggests that poetry, particularly the lucid, attentive poems of the Tang Dynasty poets that deeply influenced both Niedecker and her beloved Basho, also serves as such a lens, a compact way of seeing that might be taken from a pocket or summoned from memory, considered for a moment, overlaid upon one's present view, and then folded away again for future use. In the end, so to speak, the poet seeks not to confront the law, but to survive it, to see otherwise than its officers would have us see, perhaps to evade the law by letting property slip away and be replaced, as Niedecker has it elsewhere, by poetry. 2. Television, clams, and veeries. I'm going to share another poem with you now. Traces of Living Things, with its strange feeling of sequence, as Stuart Montgomery described it, is one of my favorite works by Niedecker. The second poem in the sequence is a marvel of binocular focus. Far reach of sand, a man bends to inspect a shell, himself part coral and mud clam. Kenneth Cox once incisively observed that at length Niedecker's versification came to consist of nothing but syllables placed one under another at different angles and different distances. End quote. Here, her simple, unpunctuated arrangement of words and syllables affords multiple angles of vision and a complex interaction of distances. We might first notice that the poem lays two frames, one syntactical, the other stanzaic, atop one another. But rather than coincide with the poem's three syntactical units, each flagged gently by a capital letter, far reach of sand, a man bends to inspect a shell, and himself part coral and mud clam, its three-lined, stepwise stanzas rest lightly askew from these phrases, so that we can read the poem doubly at each juncture. Taking just the first phrase, far reach of sand, we might imagine a long view of a beach, its gentle curve along the water. And then completing the first stanza with a slant rhyme, far reach of sand, a man, we place in the distance at the end of that curve a small human figure. But at almost the same time, we must uncouple a man from sand and take it as the start of a sentence that runs across the stanza break. A man bends to inspect a shell. With just a few syllables, we zoom in closely on this man's figure, now curving in for a closer look at something small in the sand. The second stanza concludes with another slant rhyme, ends to inspect a shell himself, that transforms the discovery of another creature into a moment of self-encounter. But again, the completion of this stanza doubles as the start of another phrase that takes us into the final stanza. Himself, part coral and mud clam. Here, the poem zooms in even more to consider the microscopic, genetic, or elemental kinship of human beings, coral, mud, and mud clams, while simultaneously zooming way out to conjure the vast time and space scales of natural history. In 17 words, the poem's far reach extends at once across the beach, from a man down to a clamshell in the sand, across millennia of species evolution on Earth, and even into the hugeness of space, in which stars first exploded to create the elements that compose living creatures. The next of Niedecker's traces, the second poem in the sequence, is subtitled TV. See it explained, compound interest and the compound eye of the insect, the waveline on shell, sand, wall, and forehead of the one who speaks. After prompting us to see, the poem presents another double: financial instrument that makes the most of itself, and an optical organ that provides an especially wide view and special sensitivity to quick movement, like compound interest, the compound eye. Both are compound, a single thing made by binding multiple elements tightly together. And the poem itself is a kind of compound. Thus, Niedecker asks us to consider a complex likeness, while also comically conjuring the world of mid-century informational television programming. The whole world explained to you in the comfort of your own home, ladies and gentlemen. And then the second stanza doubles the first by repeating its shape on the page and by repeating its homological thinking. Wavy striations echo naturally across crustacean shells, drifting sand, rock faces, and now in the rhythmic imperfections of the cathode ray tube, slightly disturbing the talking head beamed in from a studio somewhere. With subtle swiftness, Niedecker places mass media and its apparatus in the continuum of geological time. The form of the wave ripples through the earth, across the seas, and right through our living room. The quick scale shifting continues in the next poem in the sequence, too. It starts big, both spatially and temporally, and then narrows to a very fine here and now. We are what the seas have made us, longingly immense, the very veery on the fence. My first thought when reading the first two lines is of oceans as the original scene of life on Earth. I think then of the seas as the way people have moved around the Earth, shores as the places they've built settlements and cultures, and waterways as their routes inland. And when I arrive at longingly immense, I imagine both the oceanic vastness of what Douglas Crace has called Niedecker's evolutionary sublime, and the plainer longing one might feel for someone gone across the sea, as countless sea shanties render in song. With the final lines, though, the expansive sea gives way to a bounded yard or field, huge longing to the confines of property. Yet the property line itself becomes the site of song, the place where the veery perches. And here's another double or two. It's not just any veery, it's the very veery. The veery, a bird that harmonizes with itself, its split voice box producing two notes at once. Its uncanny song becomes the acoustic emblem of Niedecker's binocular vision, a poetry that sings and sees at once, that follows its sound into vision, that even while caught within the strictures or the structures of poverty, never loses sight of the earth before or beyond its enclosures. Three, embarrassment. What I've been describing is a kind of ambition in Niedecker's poetry, a sense of imaginative vastness, even in poems that take up very little space on the page. I also think of her sheer persistence as a poet, especially when no one was publishing and very few were reading her poems, as a kind of ambition. Not professional ambition, but poetic ambition. And not the ambition to write a great poem, though I believe she did write great poems, but the ambition to live with, in, and through poetry. Her example is inspiring. Yet Niedecker also articulates, more deeply, more sharply than any other poet I've read, the embarrassment of being a poet, of having committed oneself to something as weird and seemingly pointless as writing little lines that almost no one ever reads. Many poets, perhaps, are beyond embarrassment. Consider the last two stanzas of a 1950 poem. Get it up here. A 1950 poem about her work as a stenographer and proofreader in the print shop at Hoard's Dairyman, the dairy farming trade publication that she was a proofreader for. I'm sure all of you who are in Fort Atkinson or in the environments know about Hoard's Dairyman, but others might not. I heard their rehashed radio barbs, more barbarous among hirelings, as higher-ups grow more corrupt. But what vitality! The women hold jobs, clean house, cook, raise children, bowl, and go to church. What would they say if they knew I sit for 2 months on 6 lines of poetry? Like the death of my poor father, this poem holds poetry in tension with economic conditions. Here, Niedecker compares herself to the folk among whom she works, ambivalently expressing both solidarity and distance. She critiques management's corruption while judging the workers barbaric. Their language is rehashed, prefab mass media cliches uncritically reproduced. Her awe at her co-workers' busy lives seems both sincere and slightly superior. There's also perhaps a note of regret in the list of responsibilities and pastimes Niedecker had not accumulated by middle age. She holds herself apart with a poet's pride, while also worrying about her co-workers' opinion of her, perhaps with good reason. There is something ridiculous about the extremely inefficient, self-indulgent labor of writing, sitting 2 months on 6 lines, especially contrasted with the labor of people who are simultaneously wives, mothers, and office workers. What would they say? You can imagine the barbs, maybe the simple bewilderment, maybe a few notes of mild appreciation. Maybe you've even heard them before yourself. Yet Niedecker cops to her indulgence, at least on the page. She leaves the poetry for us to read, but keeps it from her co-workers and neighbors. So there's also the slightest air of defiance in these lines. Hatching only poems, the poet withholds part of herself from the economy with an ascetic's resolve. But while the ascetic makes a public performance of his withholding, Niedecker also withholds her poetry from those around her, as though something embarrassing might also be a sustaining secret, something that thrives on privacy. A vision held close, a sense of possibility that survives within enclosure. I find an image of this possibility in a short 1957 poem, a 5-liner Niedecker wrote while working at Fort Atkinson Memorial Hospital. Fog, thick morning. I see only where I now walk. I carry my clarity with me. Here I think of pocket binoculars, or a small book of small poems, ways of seeing that might be folded up and carried close to one's person. A person moving through the world, taking stock of her immediate surroundings, subject to shifts in weather and other conditions, ready with a rhyme, perhaps only she hears, seeing things as clearly as she can. This is the poet's essential privacy, her self-sufficiency. How many of them, of us, are walking through the fog now, unseen, yet seeing, sustained by a handful of syllables? Thanks. That's what I've got.
Thank you, Patrick.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
I'm gonna let
So let's
that,
talk.
yeah, I'm gonna let that sit for just a second, and let people collect their thoughts.
Yeah.
So as we start like the discussion here. We've got about, a little over 30 people. So how do you prefer for us to engage in the conversation? Should people just kind of unmute and start talking? Do you want people to raise their hands? What
Yeah,
do you think would be useful?
I think let's I guess we can unmute.
Hmm.
And if you're in a place that's loud, this is what I haven't taught on Zoom for a long time, thankfully, but usually works. I think that unless you're in a loud place, people can unmute. Uh and uh and then let's raise, I guess raising the digital hand might be the best way to get my attention. And David or Chuck, if you could
Yeah,
sort of keep an eye on the hands too, in
yeah,
case I miss something while I'm talking, that would be
definitely.
great.
And I can get started unless somebody else
Great.
wants to
Yeah,
do
please do.
that. As you were talking, I was thinking about when people think about Niedecker, they often think about lines like, sit for 6 months or 2 months on 6 lines of poetry or whatever that
Yeah.
line was, and this kind of idea of I guess slowness or
Hmm.
deliberateness. But then there's also a lot in her work about geologic time.
Yeah,
Like
right.
in your mind, are these related? Are these separate things? Because you also talked a lot about, you talked a lot about poems that brought forward that kind of geologic time
Hmm.
element in her work. Um, so I guess I'm just asking you to riff on that a little bit.
Yeah.
And also, I guess I'm thinking of it as because I do sometimes read her work as like a necessary critique of our time, even though she's not living in
Hmm.
our time, right?
Hmm.
Because we tend to read, I think
Right.
often we tend to read work like this and say, what is she saying to me? But I'm thinking, I don't know if you can think about these things a little
Yes.
bit, like geologic time versus her practice as a poet, and are these things, I guess, related in your mind?
I think so. I would say about the to your first question that I think to me, one of the marvels and pleasures of Niedecker's work and reading it again and again over time is the way that I hear lines land with a different tone to me in different readings. And when reading her, and I sort of try, I think a little bit when I was, working on this essay, I kind of like, there's maybe like one paragraph that when you read my dissertation chapter when I was working on it quite helpfully, you might have recognized like a little bit of the language from the first reading of that poem, My Poor Father. And then I kind of took a second pass at it, at this with a different kind of emphasis. And for me, one of the things that I love about her work, and really that I love about a lot of the poets whose work sustains me and I keep coming back to, is that the poem is never quite the same twice. And I think there's a particular way that Niedecker's um, the relative reticence of her work, but with like a real tonal subtlety and sort of ear for the way that language works. Like she's not a conversational poet particularly, but she has a strong sense of the way that language works in conversation, and so that you can read a line in different and sort of different tones and registers. So I think it's true that the line I sit for 2 months, I sit for what was it? I sit for uh 2 months on 6 lines of poetry. Um, we can read that simultaneously three ways, right? One is like I really take my time with my craft, and that's a virtue, and that's like it kind of signals a poetic virtue, but also like you know, man, I'm a little sheepish because I'm so slow. Um, and I work, and there's a lot of other people working, and who has time for this kind of thing? But then also, and I think in the context of her work as a whole, which, as you, I think, point out, like that geological time, I mean, I think, Niedecker would probably think, well, you know, the earth, they kind of within it, I think she had a kind of ambivalent embrace of her own sort of architectonic slowness as a poet. Like it was having read her letters and her, sometimes it was seemed to be a source of anxiety or dismay, and other times a sense of like, this is my craft. I certainly can relate to that.
And could be a source of humor, right? Because
Yeah,
I
right.
mean, the part of the way I read that poem is that concluding um, comment refers to the previous six lines, right?
Hmm.
Like, so
Yeah, right.
basically, it's this kind of joke that's, I mean, in a way, it's a joke that's saying it took me 2 months to write the six lines that came before.
Yeah, right,
Yeah, and so
right.
there is, I think there is a little bit of her kind of poking fun at herself in the poem itself. Anyway, yeah.
Definitely. No, I agree. And on the topic of then of time, also, I mean, Fred, she's a poet, and I think maybe now people are there's more readings of Niedecker as a poet, sort of writing about a certain historical moment. I mean, to your second point too, about like what we might find about Niedecker for our own time, but also especially in the 60s, like those poems in other parts of the Traces of Living Things, there's references to the Bay of Pigs and to the Secretary of Defense knew precisely what the Undersecretary of State was talking about. I think it's the line or something like that. So there are these sort of subtle ways that and then there's another poem from that period where she's hiding from the long range guns, right? There's kind of a Cold War imagination in the 60s poems, which I think does open up to the thinking sort of in world historical. That's another there's the natural historical layers, but then there's also sort of a lot of colonial history in her poems. But then also there's the historical moment that she was living in, and certainly, especially in their sort of ecological concerns, I think she's anticipating a lot of what is especially acutely relevant for us now. Um, anyway, other
Yeah, who has questions for Patrick?
yeah,
We have plenty of time.
yeah. Rick, is that your hand?
Sorry, I'll unmute myself. Um, I was just thinking in relation to The Secret, and when you said Niedecker being kind of a secret, that the other doubleness of that poem seems to be that as she is not understood by her coworkers, she does not understand her own poem, and that there is this secret being kept from her by the writing.
Hmm.
I even want to like bend the grammar. Like, what would the lines say if they knew I was sitting on them for 6 months? Like,
I love that. Yes,
so it
right.
feels like some acknowledgement of at
Hmm.
the same time that there's this distance. There's
Right.
also the things she can't know or understand
Yeah.
present in the poem at that moment that seemed really.
Right. 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 That's great. And that sense of like, yeah, because sitting on lines is also suggests in a way a kind of passivity. It's like it's a full waiting, but that is also possibly maybe she's not even touching them in that time, right? And I at least I for one can relate to that experience of like you write something and you're kind of compelled by it and you put it aside, you really don't know what it means, right? Even maybe long after you publish it too, even if it finds its way into a poem, and that those are sometimes the poems that are for me remain the most interesting, the
Mhm.
ones that feel like you're still sitting on them in some way, even when they're done, when you finish writing, even when you've shown them to other people, that there's a kind of
They
uh,
haven't
un,
aged.
they
Yeah.
haven't hatched, right? Right. Yeah. No, that's great. I love that additional layer of the reading. Yeah.
And that's,
Yeah.
yeah, coming out of the way you're, yeah, just that you keep, when you come back to it, like you said, this is the mystery of these poems that they manage to shift underneath you.
Yes. Yes. Right. Definitely. Definitely. Yeah.
I wonder if I could jump in with another question while people are thinking.
Yeah, sure.
So I jotted down, and I don't know if I got this down exactly correctly. Um, but I'm trying to quote you here, so
Okay.
apologies if I fail.
Uh-oh.
Many poets are perhaps beyond embarrassment. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about your concept of embarrassment
Yeah,
in
I'm
this
actually,
talk.
yeah, right. I'm kind of curious. So that's the part of the talk that's just like was a little bit the weird. I felt like I was going out on a limb a little bit more. In the third part, I was kind of like, all right, I'm gonna take a left turn. And I don't know exactly what I think about this, but Um, I think that my sense of embarrassment. I mean, in some sense, I guess I'm talking about my own sense of embarrassment about being a poet, and I don't. Uh, and I don't mean that in a necessarily like I'm going to ever stop doing. You know, it doesn't. It doesn't. I feel like Niedecker's poem sometimes kind of can wryly acknowledge something. Like she manages to both be totally committed to poetry while also kind of holding in tension with that some of the ways that the pursuit of writing poetry can seem kind of either economically sort of pointless or reckless, but also to kind of make you feel silly, even while you love doing it, where it feels like you get that kind of fullness from it. And that really resonates with me. I mean, and I, I would, if it does, if like, you know, if a poet is not alert to the kind of ridiculousness of the pursuit at some time, like that seems hard for me to believe in a way, or like beyond embarrassed, like you're beyond like a certain kind of self-awareness of the strangeness of this art. And for me, you know, and I think also like there's a kind of something, this is maybe a weird tangent, but like something that I have become alert to or sensitive about in the last few years are kind of like how like aggrandizing a lot of like defenses of poetry can be, or kind of like in like out of a sense of like doubt about the art, rather than like acknowledging a kind of weakness or a kind of liability or embarrassment. There's kind of like an overstatement of like this like epic poetry as like the salvation of the world, right? We know that tendency in like defenses of poetry. So I'm interested in trying to think about poetry in a way that both allows for doubt and embarrassment while also um, love it, you know, being totally committed to it. Because for me, if I can't acknowledge the embarrassment um, or tell people that I find it embarrassing sometimes, then it feels my attachment to it somehow feels like compromised or hollow. Like I want to be able to do both. I don't know. Devin, were you going to say something?
Oh yeah, I was the embarrassment thing, this is maybe I mean this is just a joke, but there's a question that come out of it. But I was
Good,
listening to Willie Dixon yesterday, and there's this song
good.
about peeping, how he gets
Uh,
arrested for peeping. So I
uh-huh.
was thinking that the binoculars and peeping, there's also this
Yeah.
sense of the type of sight that she does, especially
Mm-hmm.
of the dude. There's this
Mm-hmm.
kind of, there could be read into it that if you wanted,
Yeah.
if you had a mind. But
Mm-hmm.
I guess that I was thinking about the reading of the doubling that you were talking about, and I kind of wanted to ask you to talk a little bit more about the difference between reading the book and looking with the binoculars, and if you thought in rereading the poetry, if there was a difference between reading and seeing for her.
Yeah. Right.
I know
Right.
that's one of those sorts of, yeah. So that's the
Yeah.
question.
Right. So, I mean, I think one of the, you know, one of the things I'd say in the talk is I think part, like, I kind of have, I find it sort of fancy the poem, that pairing of the book and the binoculars to, in a way, be wanting to sort of imagine a see-through book, right? Or a book that becomes a kind of lens, right? Or like literalizing that metaphor, right? I'm also thinking, I've just been, this week I was teaching the Popol Vuh in Michael Bazzett's translation. And there's a line in that, actually I have it on my desk here, in the that I remember, always remember, and I talk with my students about this a lot. When in the preamble says, "We'll bring it forth." This is talking about the transcription of the Popol Vuh. We'll bring it forth because there's no longer a way to see the ancient book, the Popol Vuh. So it's telling we're going to like tell the story, write it down when we can no longer see it. And then I was to see the ancient book, the Popol Vuh, that way of seeing clearly that came from beside the sea. So like throughout the book, the story itself is identifying it as a way of seeing. And I love that. I'm drawn to that idea that, like, yes, a book is something we look at. The page is kind of an opaque thing you look at, but that also it can imagine it as something you look through. in the way that you look through binoculars. And I was also drawn. I think I was also drawn to the idea, like there's something, like when you're bird watching or peeping or whatever you're doing, right? And you're taking the there's something like that with the head up and down from the page. Like if you'd imagine, like, and I kind of, we don't often read that way, like where you're like, look, I mean, unless you're using a field guide, maybe, right? Where you're like working up from the book and the page out into the world a lot. And it can be kind of disorienting, especially if you wear glasses, it can be kind of dizzying. And I was kind of interested in that effect too, of the way that when you are moving back and forth, rapidly shifting your scale and your vision with the binoculars too, it can be both like dizzying, but also if you can figure out how to poise it the right way, you can kind of have that sense of seeing two things at once.
Just something I wanted to point out, the additional doubling of the Chinese Book of Poems is that it's a translation. As far as I know, she didn't read Chinese.
She did not, no. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, totally.
So you have to adjust your vision to see into another poem.
Yes, right. Good. Yeah. Which also, for me, it feels like it's weirdly converging with the Popol Vuh, because even in the preamble of the Popol Vuh, there's all this attention to the experience of translation and how one way of seeing can like sort of occlude or alter another. Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Tinker. Carl.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I really love the wordplay in her work. And one specific example is that very, very.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a kind of, you wonder if she didn't have that, like I want to write a poem so that I can put that in there. Very, very, it's just, right. And she does that a lot. The barbed and barbarous, and I think there was one other one too. That's sort of part of the way she works.
Yeah, I would, of course, I can only speculate about her way of working, but certainly, to Rick's point too, about like sitting on something. I mean, for me, often the experience of writing a poem is like some pair of words gets stuck in my ear, right? Or I remember it for years even, and it hasn't found its poem yet. It hasn't found its context, right? And then over time, maybe it finds a few other words or the certain constellation of words and sounds that allow it to sort of come to rest in the structure of a poem. So that, she could, I like to imagine, sort of speculating, that she had just the idea of that phrase, the very very, hanging around or stuck in her ear for a long time.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Patrick, I wonder if your practice as a poet, do you see, so as you're speculating about what Niedecker's compositional practice is or whatever, do you feel like it? Do you feel like it's similar to your own? Is that part of the kinship that you feel? Do you feel that the way she writes is similar to the way that you approach your writing?
I think so. Yeah, I think it is. Or at least I feel in her whatever version of Niedecker writing I imagine. I feel some recognition or some, and I think that's why I'm also like drawn. When she articulates certain, what I'm calling embarrassment, it feels like a kind of embarrassment that I can get with. I can relate to that. I think, and I've been reading Niedecker for a long time now, and so it's hard. In some ways, she's one of a handful of poets who I feel so close to. As I said, I sort of forget sometimes what's her and what's me. It can feel like that certain kind of closeness or influence. I think, and her, that sort of interest in sound play, or the way that syllables can kind of unfold from one another, and a certain kind of simultaneity of different sensory or different senses. You can kind of coalesce in a cluster of sounds. Feels very, very close. I think that, but I'm not one of the things, and I don't, if by her telling, if you were to read when you read the letters and her poems, it sounds like it was always like very slow and a kind of, and one of the things that is really interesting to me about poetry is how variable its times can be, the experiences of writing it. So that, and I have a few of my students are in this Zoom room, and they've probably heard me harp on this or talk about this, that you never know how long. There's something mysterious about the time poetry takes, and that sometimes it takes 5 or 10 years to write a poem, and you don't know you're working on it all that time, and then you somehow realize like, oh, that line, that phrase, the very viri or whatever it was that I was so drawn to 10 years ago, and I could never find a home for it. I'm walking down the path, and it falls into my ear again, and suddenly it happens, and there's the poem. I did return to that poem for 10 years, and I finally got it right. Or sometimes it's just the whole poem comes together in like 30 seconds, right? You can write poems that by design take a certain amount of time to write, and that's really interesting to me. And I don't know. I don't know I haven't really thought about that in terms of Niedecker's work. But since we've just been talking about slowness here, I'm also interested in the way, and I experience sometimes it's very fast for me too. And so I'm interested in the kind of unaccountable mysteriousness of poetry's, the time of composing poetry. It's kind of a weird digressive answer to your question, but yeah, Jeremy.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed the talk, and I wonder if we could loop the question about process sort of back to your thinking about embarrassment.
Yeah,
sort of in reading that two stanza
make
poem.
it work, make it connect, because
I'm curious. I'd be curious what you think about this. I hear you as framing the embarrassment as caused by the brevity, right, in that poem, and but the other way we could think about that is that brevity is caused by embarrassment or threat. And here I'm thinking of how the second stanza is shorter than the first.
Yeah, right.
Line is just 1 or 2 words. It's kind of chopped. I'd be curious either for yourself or in your sort of closer Niedecker. Do you feel like the embarrassment is productive, I guess, basically?
Yeah, right.
Or where?
Productive of her style, maybe in some way. I mean, I think that I take her embarrassment. What I would say is her embarrassment is about inefficiency in a certain way, right? It's about a kind of mismatch of the time of art and the time of like productive life, or something like that. Wage earning, getting your chores done, right? And that discrepancy, and that's my first order reading of what the embarrassment is about there. And I think, but also, Niedecker is sometimes, I think, over described. There's kind of an overemphasis on her reticence and sort of, her reticence or the sparseness of work. But that's also a very accurate description for work. The poems are generally quite short and reserved, and we know, she was like more, the idea of like reading the poems aloud, right, was a source of embarrassment, right? There's only those handful of recordings that Sid Corman made. And so there is like a kind of, I mean, I didn't know her, so I don't know exactly what the tenor of that is, but I think it is, you could imagine a certain, reserve in the poems as in some way an expression of embarrassment. Be interesting to think about a style of, because right, there are there are different ways of thinking about in the kind of literary historical narrative of modernism and imagism coming from Pound and then into objectivism. Brevity is often, if you were like, what are the words that if you do like word clouds of like what often happens around short poems, there isn't so much emphasis on like embarrassment and reticence, as it's like reticence is often a kind of like almost confrontational reticence and kind of confidence, a steely classicism, right? A kind of control, a kind of precision, right? that is like always holding its own. So it's interesting to think about a kind of brevity or minimalism that isn't necessarily the minimalism of like intensely worked density, but that maybe has other comes out of other kinds of pressures or values.
I like that.
That's interesting to me. Because Niedecker's poetry is also, certain sort of minimalist poets, the poems have that kind of, the gem-like or the rock-like clarity, right? And her poetry is certainly clear, but it's also very porous, right? It's by design. It's so lightly punctuated, that quality that Kenneth Cox was talking about, of syllables, right, like just placed together at different angles and distances from one another. So I do find one of the things that draws me to her work and her craft, and this is something I've tried to learn from over time, is as a kind of a sense of a permeable and porous short poem that is not like a rock hard kernel of wisdom or clarity, but that has other ways of coming in and out of the text.
I love that.
Cool. Yeah.
Patrick, I see that
I see
Chad has his hand up.
Chad, yeah.
Yes, I just had two comments. The first one is growing up, raising my family around Black Hawk Island.
Yeah.
Or living here for 25 years.
Mm-hmm.
There's a different perspective I have from living here.
Yeah.
And going to Black Hawk Island for a long time.
Yeah.
Taking my kids there. The people of influence in Fort Atkinson at the Horde Publishing Company as the artists is still it's kind of trying to figure out the tension. So I feel like she has some tension there between people in publishing for the dairy industry and people who poetry.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like one of them is productive and economic, and the other one is idealism.
Mm-hmm.
And the second point is the part of the Rock River that is at Black Hawk Island is extremely flooded. So every 4 seasons is different. This spring is different than last spring. This fall is different than last fall, so on and so forth down each of the seasons. So every single season in her backyard and up and down the street or it's probably a gravel road that's flooded of where she lives, had a different look with the flora and the fauna than the year before.
Yeah. Right. And there, that I think that David said in the intro, mentioned the kind of emphasis in the Friends of Lorine Niedecker on poetry of place, right? And I think that the time signature of her poetry is very much that the slowness that we've been talking about, and the way that you might return to poems, the poems return to, there's a kind of seasonal rhythmic quality to the work that is the sense of Niedecker's poetry of returning to the same places again and again, right? And there is some way, maybe some analog for thinking about returning to the same places again and again, returning to the same poems again and again, and having them open up differently in different seasons, so to speak. Yeah.
Well, Patrick, this was really amazing. Thank you so much for your time tonight and for your
you're welcome.
Thoughts. And
my pleasure.
I think it's been a difficult week for a lot of people, and this is a really nice way to start a new week coming up. And thank you everyone for coming. I know that we have people from, I guess, kind of all over the country, and maybe even outside of this country, which is really nice to see. So, keep our little organization in mind. I hope when you see notifications for further events, you check those out as well. And have a good night, everybody. And thanks again, Patrick. We really appreciate
thank you all very
spending
much.
this time with you. Yeah, it was really great.
I really had a good time. Thank you.